today.
Yes, and this will be a very brief introduction, but we have a docent, Jim Kurtz, is going to talk today, and he has an interesting topic, which is about, well, he calls it connections in art, seeing gesture, and I'm really intrigued about where he's going to go with that. So with that, Jim, it's for you.
And just a side note too, I apologize, the coffee's not here yet, but when it does get here, please feel free to get your coffee and water. And we're sorry about the interruption, Jim. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Well, I'm thankful I see a few friends here, so everyone won't be throwing eggs, I hope. So as docents, we find ourselves trying to identify interesting themes for tours of art objects at the Harn Museum of Art. While thinking about and searching for themes, I came across a website at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met, in New York City. It showed a few dozen short video clips presented by curators and staff at the Met, describing tour themes that they thought would be useful for tours, either with docents leading those tours or even for those individuals who wanted to do that on their own. And in each of those short clips, 3 to 5 minutes, they described some of the, or showed some of the objects in the Met collection that they thought would support the idea of gesture. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So the one I chose from that site to prepare a tour for was related to gesture. It was given by one of the docents, curators, I should say actually curator of Asian art at the Met, Denise Leiden. And what she had to say about that at the beginning of her short clip was, "It's what I see first and how I understand almost everything I see." So a physical gesture could be a variety of different actions. It might be composed of a small wave of the hand, large movements incorporating the entire body, the torso, or simply be a state of being, the posture that the subject is taking on, or a stance. Often in artwork, gestures are regarded as intentional movements that perhaps the artist created or chose to present certain ideas that he or she had. But sometimes they are just perceived by the observer and may not have actually been intended by the artist.
Pardon the interruption. Mr. Kurtz, would you like the lights down or leave them up?
We could try with the lights down.
Okay.
So another idea about gesture that Ms. Leiden presented in her short clip was that a gesture need not be a physical manifestation of the human body, but can be exhibited differently. In paintings, gesture can be expressed or represented by brush strokes, very small ones like Kehinde Wiley's, or large like Pollock's or Krasner's. Even though they are sometimes non-representational, they can still be representative of the artist's motions or gestures. In human sculptures, gesture lines are more obvious, but other sculpture shapes can also have flowing lines suggestive of a gesture, and we'll look at one example of that. Photographs, drawings, and other art media can also suggest gesture in similar ways. I chose for the first art object one that has been in the Asian collection at the Harn, specifically in the Korea section at the Harn. What I observed, and in each of these, I'll give you some of my initial thoughts, and that I had, and then we'll talk a little bit more. I'll try to see if you have any thoughts. The posture of this object, the seated lotus position, and the facial expression, the downcast eyes, large ears, and slight smile give the sense of a meditative bodhisattva. The folds of the robe add to the relaxed flow of the sculpture. The hands display the gestures of fearlessness, the right hand, and gift bestowing. This artwork comes from the, as I said, from the Korean, not getting the pointer to work here. There we go. In the Korean section of the Asian gallery, and it was in the Joseon dynasty, actually, which was quite a number of years, couple of centuries, but was done around the 17th century, and it's actually created out of wood. So when I look at the facial expressions on this object, a few things come to mind: the downcast eyes, the large ears, the slight smile. A bodhisattva is a deity in Buddhism that has as his responsibility in life to care for sentient beings. That would be somebody like me, just an average person. And that can be he or she's long-term responsibility or mission, I guess I would say, to carry out those duties, whatever they are. And what she is trying to do is aspire to be like Buddha, and ultimately even ascend to be a Buddha herself. So in this particular case, the ears reminded Buddha, because he had large ears as well, that he came from a wealthy family. That's what it means in their culture. But he was constantly reminded that he wanted to follow the meditative middle way and search out enlightenment. When we look at the hands, as I mentioned, there are two mudras, as they are called. And mudras are gestures of the hands that we see in sculptures and paintings of both Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. They're depending on the tantric culture, that is the Indian or Asian culture. There can be a number of these used, maybe more than 26 single hand gestures and 13 combined hand gestures that are used. In the right hand of this, as I said, we are seeing a mudra that represents fearlessness. Sometimes this can be shown with the palm completely open, depending on the culture and the particular bodhisattva that we are observing. The left hand is representing more a gift bestowing gesture. I noticed the posture to me in this art object looks very relaxed. And so I think that tends to support the meditative spirit. The clothes that we see are robes, which would be sort of like a regal person would wear. I noticed too, when I looked down on the torso, and even more so in the face, that we see some of the gold gilt that has been worn off and now showing the black wood that lies underneath. And the gilt, of course, stands for or indicates royalty when we look at this particular art object and others that have been done. So overall, to me, the Buddha represents a meditative spirit, which just by looking at this particular Buddha. So this is a point at which I'm going to ask you, what do you see? Does anyone see more in this Buddha? I'm sorry, this Bodhisattva?
Well, I'm not sure whether this is relevant or not, but because we know the piece and it's been x-rayed over at Shan's, we know that it has sutras inside. I'm not sure what to make of that, but that's a part of the meditative aspect, I think. Sutras, religious texts, paper ones in this case.
Yes, for those who might not be aware, this Bodhisattva was taken to Shan's some years back, not long after the Harn received the object, and it was put under X-ray, powerful X-ray machine. And it was determined that there, as the gentleman said, there were religious texts called sutras in both the head and even down some into the torso. They removed some of the sutras, but it was not possible without perhaps damaging the Bodhisattva to remove all of them. So there still are some contained within this Bodhisattva.
I'm curious about the headdress. It looks to be perhaps metal, and it looks maybe like it doesn't fit his head too well and wouldn't be too comfortable.
Yeah.
What can you say about that?
Yeah, I couldn't find distinct information about all the different types of headdresses that bodhisattvas wear. Often what you see, and I don't think this is what we're seeing here, but you'll see the hair pulled up into a sort of like a top of the head pigtail or ponytail. And again, this is complementary of what Buddha had done, because when he was young and decided to seek out the meditative way, he decided to cut his very long hair and wear it in an upward sort of bob fashion.
We have a comment here?
Please elaborate on the large ears. If I understood you correctly, it was a sign of he came from a wealthy family.
That's right. So in their culture, that was an indicator of this person is regal, he or she is wealthy. And so we see that in most of the statues or pictures of Buddha, and we also see it in the bodhisattvas, who are, again, striving to be like Buddha and have a lot of the characteristics in their physical makeup that look like Buddha. Okay, next I wanted to talk about another art object that's in the Asian art wing of the Harn, but quite obviously is not a human form. But I'd like to talk a little bit about that and some of the things that I saw and discovered when looking at this more. When I first looked at this, I thought the flowing lines of the sculpture suggested something organic or moving. One could imagine something lifelike emanating from the sculpture. So to me, it seems the gesture of the artist as she or he is forming this object is integral to the sculpture. Again, going back to Denise Leiden at the Met, she also showed some non-human forms or objects, and she was pointing out certain aspects of gesture that she could see in those objects. This artwork was done by a young artist, relatively young artist, and is a much more modern day object than the one we were just looking at. Her name is Tomomi Tanaka. She's a Japanese artist, and she forms these types of artworks by starting out with a core piece of clay that is either, say, a cone shape or a sphere. And then she adds these flowing lines of very, very small pieces of clay that she places very delicately, sometimes with tweezers, onto the artwork, which is very time consuming and a meticulous task to do that. These lines she refers to as laminas. It's spelled Lallamena. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is in a couple of areas of science, these laminas are being investigated because they have certain strength. They are found, for example, in the nacre or the mother of pearl mollusk. It has, if you look at it, it has a number of lines across it, which are found to give it strength. So this is being, it turns out those same laminas are being used in medical devices and equipment that's inserted into humans and for other purposes as well, for structural integrity. As I said, to me, this represents organic motion, and I can sort of sense seeing the artist as she places these lines onto the object. I feel that the nature of this flame going up, and this is called black flame, is indicative of an uplifting again, or maybe perhaps a meditative spirit being associated with it, and which is fitting for being an Asian object. So I asked myself, is this intended to be meditative or spiritual? And that will affect everyone differently. What else do you see in this artwork?
I have a question about the process that you described, her process in making this. I got confused. It looks as if she took her hands in clay and made these beautiful swirls, but then you say that she placed things with tweezers. So did she start with swirls and then place things on top of them, or?
Again, and she, from what I've read about her work, she starts with some sort of form. In this case, it's usually often a sphere is used, but in this case, I think what she may have started with was a cone, and then she added these layers painstakingly on top of the cone and built it up in that way. So she has a strong base of clay that she's working with before she adds these pieces on.
I feel like it was made with a great deal of love. And when you showed it initially, my first reaction was it almost feels like it hugs you.
Like it hugs.
Like it hugs you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to follow up on Mary's question about how this was created. Understanding you may not know the answers, but first of all, it looks as if, let's say it was a cone originally, that it was then separated into thirds before these pieces were applied. And I mean, if every single ridge or line was, say, created separately, fired separately, and then applied either by hand or with tweezers or something else, it's very interesting that it does have such a meditative or spiritual appearance, given that that process would seem to be, at least to me, so painstaking that it's interesting and paradoxical. But can you say anything else about the process of creating it? And just one other unrelated question. Could you tell us the approximate size of this, or maybe just show us with your own hands? Is it huge, or is it something you could carry yourself? Or
Yeah, pages here from our coordinator of docents. Yeah, I would say about maybe 18 inches.
Definitely carry it.
Oh.
You can hold it. Yeah.
I don't know much more about the construction of this particular one. I watched a few of her videos where she started, and it looked like, again, she just used a core piece and then added those on. Now, it's possible, I guess, I don't know the answer, that she might have formed this side to some extent, and then the other side and place some of that on as sort of at least partially, and then place that on before firing. I don't think that she did, but I don't know for certain that she fired a portion and then added more and fired again. I think it was all done, and then there was one firing.
I was just curious, the third part that we can't see, is it different from the other two? Like, I mean, like the one looks like a flower or something, and the other one is more just, I don't know, swirls and so forth. The back piece that we cannot see the face of, is it a whole different picture or?
I believe it's to me, I think it's similar when you look at the back.
I just wondered if,
these
you know, she was
swirls.
doing different stages of something. I mean, it's called Black Flame,
Mhm.
and I can see that the one looks like more flame. Yeah, okay.
This work is currently on view at the museum, though it is in a pedestal up against a wall. So you can kind of see the back, but you'll mostly see the front view there too.
One of the things Amoki said about her work, this is a quote that she said, "The lines are not just a means of expressing an internal landscape, but also an entity expressing life." So that comment to me was once again a link to something organic, something that we would tie to perhaps back to gesture.
Can I ask real quick, how did you decide which face to put up against the wall?
That's a question for our curator of Asian art. That's a good question.
So the next one comes from our contemporary gallery. This is currently on view in the contemporary gallery. When I look at this painting, which is done by Kehinde Wiley, some of my first thoughts are the hands, the arms, and the faces suggest friendship of these two men. On the one hand, I sense a certain amount of calmness in each of their faces. But yet at the same time, I see strength. And I feel like each man has his own unique identity. So when I look closer, I notice that the man on the right has his right arm around the man on the left, while the other man has his hands stretched out near his knees with his hands pointing downward. It turns out that that's actually very similar to one of the mudras that I mentioned earlier in Asian art, and that particular mudra represents tying oneself to the earth. When I look at the eyes, I notice the man on the right is looking more or less out at the viewer, while the man on the left is looking up. When I look at their faces, I sense in both cases they are somewhat somber. They're definitely not smiling to me, but on the other hand, I don't really think that they're frowning. As I mentioned, the hands on the man on the left are pointed downward. The hand of the man on the right, his left hand, makes me think he's saying something. But the question is, what is he saying? What it says to me is, take us as we are, for whatever we are. When I look at the overall posture, again, it represents to me a source of strength, but at the same time, a definite uniqueness. What do you see in this object?
Well, you haven't really talked about the fact that it's the Dogon couple, and the couple really is in Dogon culture, which is in West Africa. Um, and this is supposed to be the ideal couple. Like an Adam and Eve figure. So that's it. He's gotten to it. So if you look at it that way, you sort of begin to interpret it differently because this is a couple. And the gestures then suggest whether they're supposed to be male or female. So I see you're going to go there. So I'll stop there.
Thankfully, I didn't have this in the slides, but Julie was able to help me this morning and just add this in. So this is a picture of the actual Dogon couple, seated couple, they're called. That's, I don't know if it's currently on view, but it's in the collection at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I believe it's around 18 inches to 2 feet tall. And as Laura was pointing out, it is shown with the Dogon couple painting that we just looked at. And I think it was intended to have certain linkages to at Yale. After graduating, he spent some time in Harlem at an art co-op and developed further his capabilities and sort of began to pick a genre. His genre, I would say, to use that term, is to basically go out and get volunteers or perhaps in some cases paid individuals to sit for different kinds of artwork. What he does then is he puts those individuals in a stance, a posture, or with gestures, with clothing that's representative of some historical figure or figures that are in some way generally linked to Africa or African Americans or both. In this particular case, it was a series that was done for Lagos, Dakar, which is again in West Africa. And he went out and found these individuals to sit for him to do this particular painting. Also, another characteristic that you'll see in almost all of his paintings of this genre, at least, is a background that is this highly colored, generally nature associated background, which comes from a type of fabric you would find if you went to West Africa or even other areas of Africa today. It's called kaftan, and it was introduced by the Dutch many years ago, several centuries ago. So when you go to Africa, you might find blankets or other things made out of this object. Does that answer somewhat answer your question?
The more that I observe these two gentlemen, I see the male-female aspects where the gentleman on the left, he positions his legs, usually like I see a guy with his knees open, whereas the man on the right has his knees closed like a woman sits. So I see, the gentleman on the right just a bit more effeminate, with his hand kind of in a supplication pose. But I see I see him as just, I don't know, softer, more effeminate. And the gentleman on the left is kind of a more masculine as I, look at these two.
This is one reason that when we're training at the Harn, the way we're trained is in the mode that we're attempting to present artwork is in an interpretive mode. And that mode is somewhat different than what we're doing today, but we're trying to ask open-ended questions and get the viewer to look longer at the piece and to determine what she or he thinks about the piece. And then we can get into dialogue about these things and maybe get a little bit more into the meaning as we go into that, rather than, as you've probably encountered at some museums, you just go there and the docent or curator will just tell you something about the artwork, which I find interesting as well, but that's a different style of presentation. So everyone may see something a little different, is I guess the point.
The question was about the background, and I'm trying to recall precisely what's in the background, but he was chosen to do the official portrait of Obama. And as I recall, there's vegetation that's representative of both Africa, where his family was from, and Hawaii. That may be a wrong recollection, but I think his backgrounds are very significant.
Yes, so Kehinde Wiley was chosen by Barack Obama to do his portrait for the National Portrait Gallery. If you would go to the National Portrait Gallery, you would see this portrait of Barack Obama done by Kehinde Wiley. What you would notice again is several similarities to what we're seeing here. One of those is the background, not this particular background, but one very much like it. It's sort of a green and blue flowery type background that again is representative of indicative of caftan fabric. Also, what you see in that portrait is he is sitting on a chair, much like these men are, all by himself, but he's sort of floating in space or floating in the middle of this background that you see. So if you were to go there, you wouldn't see that. Andy Wiley is quite up and coming. Maybe I shouldn't say that. He's already come up quite a ways, but he's quite popular current day artist.
Jim, I want to echo what Roy just mentioned, the flowers that are depicted in the background on the Obama portrait are the state flowers of Illinois, Hawaii, and then a flower that's more characteristic of West Africa. So it's, it's the gesture, the messages that are hidden, and the more you look, the more you see and understand. It's really, really beautiful.
Thank you for that. That's something I think I might have vaguely remembered, but it didn't come to mind. Thank you.
You know what, probably, maybe, since we had to restart it.
The next object is a calligraphy that has been in the Contemporary Gallery. Don't believe this is currently on view at the Harn. In this particular one can sense, to me, one can sense the gestures of the artist as she forms each character. Indeed, to me, the characters may imply a human form. This is done by an artist by the name of Tong Yancy, or the Americanized version would be Grace Tong. She's Chinese, born 1942, and she's done, I'll tell you more about her as we go on into the artwork. So to me, as I look at this, I sense implied motion. I can sense, having tried to do a little artwork myself, I can sense the artist trying to move the brush to create these characters that she makes for the calligraphy. And I can sense that implied motion. To me, I often feel when I look at calligraphy and certain Asian or Chinese characters, I can almost see a linkage between those characters and people. And I sense that to some extent in this one. This one is a little bit like Black Flame in terms of reading into it, the organic lines and so forth. But to me, it's more spontaneous because I can envision that this artist didn't have to spend nearly as long trying to create this as Black Flame took to create. It's a little bit challenging because I don't know what this means if I go into the Harn and I look at it. But with a little more thought, I do look into it and I cheat and I read the title block. And these characters, when translated, echo the Chinese poet Li Bo, who lived from 701 to 762, and how he viewed the brevity of one's life against the eternity enjoyed by nature. The calligraphy reads, "The floating life is but a dream." What did you see or what did you think of in this artwork?
My initial reaction was very carefree.
Hold on.
But could that be mother and son? Son would be on the left, definitely masculine, and mother might be, might be on the right.
I see people in motion, maybe a runner right underneath the 3 dots figure, and then maybe a skier below that person, and perhaps someone in a ballet position over here, but very definitely motion. And probably if you stopped the motion of any one of those three people, they are floating. Any one stance, whether it's a runner or a skier or a dancer made static, they are still, they're floating, though they're in motion.
So when I looked at this, thank you for your comments, I asked myself, wouldn't it be challenging to make the kinds of motion required to make these characters? And partial answer to that, I read this in an article about Grace Tong. She said, Tong and her family relocated to Taiwan in 1952, leaving behind a wealthy life in Shanghai. They moved to Taipei, where they were destitute and had no acquaintances. Her father assigned her and her four siblings the responsibility of mastering calligraphy, which required them to practice 100 big and 200 little characters every day during their school years. Tong adds, quote, I fell in love with it. Tong often works on the floor for large pieces. This piece was, I believe, around 2.5 to 3 feet tall, but she often works on much larger pieces. She manipulates the movement and tensions of the brushstrokes, the foremost quality in calligraphy. The characters pose physical, formal, and conceptual challenges while they offer new compositional possibility and viewing experience. Tong says about herself that she was accepted into Taiwan's most prominent business school, but chose art instead. Some people thought at the time she was not so wise. Tong has a desire to see young people lured away from the digital world and into calligraphy. She claims that her art may be interpreted as a meaningful text or just appreciated for its aesthetic value. And that is a quote of hers. In March 2020, near the beginning of COVID, a 54-meter long calligraphy by Tong was hung on the walls of the Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell University. So the size of her works range from small cards to massive displays. In 2024, Tong will create a calligraphy for the Met's Great Hall, and this will be the artist's first major project in the United States. While I was preparing this presentation, a question came up regarding a more recent addition to the Contemporary Gallery about an object that's on view there. It is not exactly what we're looking at here, but the question was raised about when we see a couple like this and we see these two characters in that picture, like this one and this one, the meaning of that. So one of the docents consulted, I believe through Page, to ask our Asian curator of art, Bang Yan Yin, to comment on the symbolism of Chinese characters in Japanese inspired woodcut of the Rosio work, which is the current work. She states the characters mean double happiness, which is a character created by putting the two Chinese characters for happiness side by side. And it is used at Chinese weddings until this day. It is still a ubiquitous contemporary practice to have it displayed as decorations at weddings, as blessings to the new couple, but is never put on the wedding gown. To me, when I look at these characters again, and we see them on each side, I definitely think there's some semblance of seeing the gesture of the couple and this jointly configured symbol that I see on each side of that. Any comments on that? Yes.
Our son, our son was married in a Buddhist wedding ceremony, and they had these double symbols. They had these table decorations, and they had little handouts for maybe it was just for the rehearsal dinner, but they had salt and pepper shakers that were unusual shaped, but they had the symbol on it. So it's definitely still being used.
Thank you. Going to skip this one, but we can come back to it if you want to talk more about it. It's in the modern collection, and there's some similarities in gesture that I was going to talk about to this one. This one is done by Alexander Archipenko. He's a Russian, actually born in Kiev, but eventually became a resident of the United States. The lines of the subject in the sculpture suggest a reclining yet reaching gesture. Tension and the term proprioception, which I learned while I was a docent, came to mind, and we'll talk more about that. So I said to myself, what would a person feel in this position? Again, and even maybe more indicative, because it's a human form, I see organic lines. When I look at the torso, when I look up at the upper part of the torso extending in the arms, when I look at the legs, I see organic lines. When I say organic lines in art, we talk about certain elements of art. One of those is line. But when we say that, in that sense, we're thinking strictly of a straight line, which could be vertical, horizontal, or some diagonal. But in this case, I'm thinking organic lines are something shaped more as with a curve, such as we see here. The person is reclining, and that's in fact the title of the artwork that Archipenko chose for it. But when I have shown this to certain students, particularly students who have studied dance and have studied medical aspects of motion, they really question that this person is reclining. They wonder if she's not reaching for something, and maybe she is. So we then get to, is she reaching or is she leaning? I learned this term proprioception while I was taking a medical group through the Harn a few years ago. And it relates to the feeling that we have internally in the tissues and in the muscles and so forth of our body that sometimes we recognize, sometimes we don't recognize, but are simply going on all the time to allow us to be in a particular position, such as the one here. So when I look at this, to me, there are feelings of tension going on. The person would have to feel a certain amount of tension to remain in this position, it seems to me. So what do you think of this object? What do you feel is in the sculpture?
This is one of my favorite pieces at the Harn. I remember when Ruth gave it. But I want to comment on the patina. I think that's a really fantastic patina and very different from most bronzes. I don't know what led him to choose that, but I think it's one of the Harn's greatest works.
Yeah, the patina we see, so this is a bronze, and Archipenko's primarily medium in his artwork was sculpture. and primarily it was human forms. He did, I would say, everything from classical human forms to very avant-garde, abstract human forms. But this particular one is in bronze. Bronze is, of course, a mixture of metals, and if left to the air for a certain amount of time, it will change color. And it does that in a way of giving you this sort of aqua blue-green color that we see here.
It looks to me as if the figure is trying to escape.
Okay.
I appreciate going to the gym, and I see this as stretching. And in stretching, you have tension, but it's a relieving, healthful tension.
Okay.
Jim, we had one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry. Just one more comment. He says it's reclining, but it's obvious. I mean, we all think it looks like tension and the pulling away. And all. Does it have anything to do with his Russian background? I mean, Russia was always, I can't imagine living in Russia and not feeling tense all the time during that period. And I just wonder if, you know, that's the best he could do to relax, but it's always tension.
It's a good question. It's one I don't know the answer to. Just a very brief few things about Archipinko. He was born in Kiev, as I said. He was around, he was a contemporary of, well, that's a blank. I'll come back to that. He was around the early 1900s, and he was contemporary of Picasso, and he was one of the first artists to exhibit. In fact, he's noted as the second artist to exhibit cubism in sculpture after Picasso. He did some training in the Ukraine, and then he traveled around Europe to Paris, Germany, where I think he had a school for a while. And then eventually in 1929, he came to the US. I don't know much more about what might have caused him in his own life to put tension and strain, but you can certainly see it if you go on and look. If you Google his name and look at his artwork, you can see these kinds of things.
I just wonder if anyone has noticed to me, there's kind of a disconnect between this fairly realistic rendition of the body itself and then the head and the face seem to be much less so. I didn't know if there's any, and if he just didn't want to bother with trying to, maybe it would be disconcerting to put more of a realistic face and head on. His emphasis is on the body, obviously.
Yeah.
But I've seen this thing in the Harn. I never really noticed that difference between the head and the face and the body.
Yeah, some of the students, it took me a while to recognize that too, and some of the students don't pick up on it. But I guess the only comment I could say about that is it's very similar to some of the more abstract human form sculptures that he's done, that the head is. But the rest, of course, to me seems like a pretty good representation of the human form.
I was just still looking at it, and I'm struck by the overall gesture of like an S form from the leg that is bent at the knee on up to the waist and then over to the raised up arm. And also the.
Anne, maybe hold the mic more toward you. There we go.
Okay, should I begin again? Do you think?
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I said I was struck by the S shape from the bent leg up to the waist and then over to the raised up the arm, which is bent at the elbow. That's quite striking, that sweep. And also the negative space on the, well, as we look at it, the left side of the sculpture. It's, to me, those are those indicate relaxed rather than tense. But I can also see the tension also, I suppose, because we don't see what's supporting her body on the
Right.
right side.
Right.
So.
You mentioned negative space, and this is one of the characteristics of Archipinko. If you look at some of his more abstract works, you see a lot of negative space. Some of those are metal sculptures, and you can see significant areas of open space that nevertheless contribute to the overall artwork, but are negative space.
I think we have time maybe for one more piece.
Okay. We'll talk about this one and then I'll close with a summary. If you were to go into the Harns lobby, I believe this is still exhibited there, shown there. You will see this artwork, and this is by Frank Stella, an American. The lines of his artwork are similar to those that are in so-called gestural paintings. A gesturalist painting expresses to the artist emotions and personality, just like a person's gestures reflect their feelings in everyday life. Jackson Pollock, if you know his artwork where he's done the swishes of paint, is thought of as a gestural painter. When I look at this, I think of those knowing having read something about gestural lines, I can see the gestural lines in this artwork, but when I look at it further, I see more in it. If I look close, I see all the colors, but if I were to look at any of these figures more carefully, what I can start to see is that each of these is a separate piece, and it's actually in 3D projected out from the artwork, and there's a grid of cross-hatched lines that are etched into the metal. So we have that working going on along with at the same time, the overall pieces. So he has several of these pieces portrayed. I believe this one is around 3 feet tall, if you were to look at it in the Harn. So to me, these different lines, the colors and so forth, all work together to create a certain amount of emotion. I don't know exactly what that is. I'm feeling a little excited, a little anxiety when I look at this, but it's definitely not something that, let's say, is a meditative piece like I might see in the Asian gallery. So I ask myself, is this expressing the artist's personality or is it something else? Maybe it's viewer perception. Maybe it's just what I see. What I see may not be what the artist felt when he was creating these. Nevertheless, to me, it's a thought-provoking piece. What is it? Anyone know what this is? Have a hunch?
Well, the title is important here because that's an automobile racetrack in Europe. And he did a whole series, each inspired by a different racetrack, as I recall.
That's right. So the title is Zandvoort, and Circuit Zandvoort, previously known as Circuit Park Zandvoort until 2017, is a 2.6 mile motorsport racetrack located in the dunes north of Zandvoort in the Netherlands. It is near the North Sea coastline. In a flourishing fashion, Stella has used his tools such as French curves, railroad curves, and his own imagination to trace out the twists and turns of Zandvoort. In Stella's own words, and I quote, "Painting these metal reliefs is a way of infusing the piece with life. The brush strokes, the flow of paint might be compared to the circulatory process in the body." Prints of the Circuit series were also made after he completed those. There's a series that was created during 1982 to 1984 of 16 prints. each of which is conceived using a different form of printmaking and come in editions of various sizes. The titles of each of the work in this series are derived from the auto racing tracks that the artist visited in the late 1970s. Stella realized how he could make the prints from the impressions of the circuits he made in wood while creating the relief paintings and cutting the metal pieces, the patterns for the metal pieces that were created. Very quickly, I'll just say that there are certain elements of gesture we see in African art, in the face and the eyes, and how the hair is coiffed. This particular one being for a woman who is preparing for certain rites of marriage. And these are characteristic of some of the other objects that we see in the Harn. This one is from an area in Nigeria. Can also see them in photography. This particular one, we see a group of women standing before a poster for a movie. I wonder when I look at it, what year is this? What are they there for? Why are they looking out the way they are? But then I think I've observed people do this in large cities. They don't look at one another. They just seem to pick a place in space and they look there. Their hands are generally, for most part, are folded and several are wearing white gloves. They're dressed conservatively. So we can see things in photography as well. Photography has a characteristic which is different from other artwork, that if it's not in some sense contrived or altered like today's modern digital photography, it is an instantaneous representation of what happened at a particular point in time. This last one is another object from our Asian gallery, and that's where we began, and that's where we'll close, but I won't talk about that one. Another thing that I found while preparing this is that I found a website with something over 40 different hand gestures that are recognized almost universally, although they mean different things in different cultures. One of those is the waving hand. Another of those in the lower right is the hands joined together, which could just represent reverence or could represent prayer. In summary, gesture connections could be used for a self-guided tour or a docent-led tour theme with a number of art objects currently displayed at the Harn. Human or other art gestures help to convey meaning and help us to think more about the artwork. Some art objects imply or suggest gesture of the artist or the subject, even though they are non-representational. And with that, I say thank you, thank you, thank you. I'll be glad to stay a few minutes if any of you have other questions that I can try to.
Yeah, just tell you next week the topic is going to be sort of how gender is represented. Gender, how gender is represented in art.